All right, so I'd like to introduce our first speaker. And our first speaker is Paul Feuerstein. Paul is the founder and president and CEO of Barrier-Free Living in New York City, and he developed the first transitional residence in the country for severely disabled homeless people, which is located in the Lower East Side. BFL has the largest domestic violence program for people with disabilities in the country. Freedom House, the first totally accessible emergency domestic violence shelter in the country, has served victims with disabilities from over 40 states and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Barrier-Free Living recently opened 120 units of supportive housing in the South Bronx. Paul authored Disabled Women and Domestic Violence, Notes from the Field, for a textbook called Service Delivery for Vulnerable Populations and New Directions in Behavioral Health, as well as many other articles. Paul has served on the chair of the NYC Federation of Mental Health, Mental Retardation, and Developmental Disabilities, and presently serves as a member of the steering committee of the New York City Domestic Violence Residents Coalition. He's a board member of Homeless Services United, a board member of the Human Services Council, and a member of its Equity Planning Group, as well as a co-founder and former chair of the Disability Network of New York City. Paul is collaborating with the Institute for the Healing of Memories in Cape Town, South Africa, and is founding chair of the board for IHOM North America. Paul is the Dean of Multi-Vocational Priests for the Episcopal Diocese of New York and co-chair of its Domestic Violence Task Force. So, Paul, thank you so much for being with us today and speaking on the very important topic of ethics. So we're going to go ahead and let you get started.
Great. I'm pleased to be with you today. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly.
Fantastic. Okay. I'm going to move the attendee list off of my deck so I can see what's going on. We're doing things a little bit differently today because we had trouble with logins and things like that. But I'm going to move forward. Oftentimes when we think about ethics, it's talking about moral principles that govern people and group behavior. And when we talk about business, I think we're really talking about the group behavior side of things. If we could move to the next slide. Hello, somebody moving? Oh, yeah, okay. What I want to talk about more than anything else, because there's a variety of ways in which we can define ethics, is talking about value systems, because that is a critical piece for us as business leaders. What are our values within our own business? Are we clear on our values? Do the people who work with us, who work for us, know what our values are? Are they driven by those values? Are the values transparent? Those are all, I think, critical pieces that we have to look at as we move forward. Next slide. Now, we are in a time of, sort of a greed is good, dog-eat-dog kind of way of doing business in many cases. But it hasn't always been that way, where, transactions had to have winners and losers. If we look to the beginning with Adam Smith, we see the sense of balancing out what it takes to have a complex economy, which means that there needs to be winners and winners. And, society needs to win in the process as well. And that's an awfully important piece in terms of what we do, is how are we contributing as members of society to be able to win ourselves in terms of our own ideas, our own business, the way in which we want to advance our particular causes, whatever they may be, but also that there's a sense of balance, that people understand that we're doing this as good corporate citizens in the process. Can we move forward? There was an article in Atlantic Magazine just in this last issue. Whoops, hello. We're going a little faster than, can we go back one? Yes, okay. Okay. John Paul Roller wrote the article saying how sociopathic capitalism came to rule the world. And it's looking at that balance between collaboration, cooperation, and competition, and finding a balance. And what has ended up happening within our society as the value of corporations has often been equated with, I need to provide profits for my shareholders as the ruling value, if you will. Let's move on to the next slide. We've ended up in situations where we've lost a lot of the collaboration and cooperation that really sustains moral and practical manners and a dynamic economy. And oftentimes, what the attitude is what have you done for me lately? And if you look at the business lifespan of a CEO in major corporations, oftentimes it's very short, because it's, have I done what I can do? Have I increased profits? Have I delivered in a short-term basis? And long-term strategic planning, long-term looking at the health of an organization, looking at long-term values, oftentimes has gotten lost in that process. Thinking about winners and losers in the process rather than thinking about collaboration. Move on to the next, please. And the question then becomes, does this way of doing business, just thinking about economic gain of stockholders, does that lead to long-term success? Move on to the next, please. I heard a webinar from Rita McGrath, who's a professor at Columbia Business School. She did research on a whole group of publicly traded companies, and she and her colleagues were looking to say, who were the growth outliers? Who were the people that did best in a long-term way? They first looked at 5-year growth outliers, and they ended up looking finally at 10-year growth outliers to say, what are the companies that have consistently grown over periods of time, both in terms of their income, in terms of their worth, and they found only 10 companies out of the 2,347 that qualified in terms of size. And the next slide will show you who those growth outliers are. Now, you can look at this list and say, what would you say are the things that these people have in common? If you look at the list, you will not see that they're all in the same business. They're all in very different businesses. I was particularly struck when I heard this presentation that Tsingtao beer was one of them. I'm a microbrewer myself, and so that sort of warmed the cockles of my heart. But there were different reasons than being in a particular market, being in a particular situation had to do. In fact, McGrath says, next slide, that it's not about industry position, it's not about the age of the firm, it's not about geography, that first world corporations are going to do better than others. It's not about emerging versus developed economies. It's not about the ownership structure or their global footprint. There are other things that are common factors. And that moves us on to the next slide. An important piece is transparency of values and the attention that's paid to corporate culture. That, to me, is a critical thing. At Barrier Free Living, my agency, we 10 years ago began a process of working with something called mission-based management. And in that process, we gathered our staff together. We gathered people we serve together in focus groups to say, what should the mission, vision, and values of Barrier Free Living be? Let's look at who we are. Let's look at what we have as our present mission. How do we want to change it? What is our vision for the future? What are we working towards? What is the world we're working towards? And then what are the values that are going to be our compass to get us there? That's been an important piece for us. So when I'm hiring a member of my management team, by the time that person gets to me, I'm assuming, and I say that to the individual, that that person is competent. What I'm looking at then is to say, what are your values? What brings you to this office today? What are the things that drive you in terms of your own career? What are the things that you find important in your own life? How does that fit into what you do for a living? How does that fit into the values of Barrier Free Living? And in that process, we have put together a team of people who are diverse. who are very diverse in terms of age, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of race, in terms of experience, but there's a commonality that they share because we have a common set of values. And that is critically important. One of the things is that all of these companies spend a significant amount of time in creating appropriate corporate culture in employment training, in executive development among the companies, and the whole emphasis on experimentation and innovation. Next slide. It becomes part of their recruitment. It's built into resource allocation. It's tapping individuals within the corporation to say, what is your creativity? What are your ideas? When somebody joins us, and when I sit with a group of interns at the beginning of a school year, because we have about 15 or 20 social work, occupational therapy interns, other interns who come to us, and I give them a copy of our mission, vision, values and say, this is your compass. Feel free to innovate. Don't be afraid to fail, because failure is a part of growth that leads to success. And that's an important message that comes out in all of these innovative companies, is looking towards the workforce, looking towards their ideas, looking and saying, here's our values. If you use this as your compass, you may fail, but you're not going to be fired for failing. It's what you do. It's saying, what have you learned from the experience? Now, Einstein basically said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We would say the same thing. If somebody tries to innovate and does the same thing over and over again, we'll say, wait a minute, you haven't learned from that experience. You need to think in other ways. Next slide. But the value of employees is critical. In all 10 companies, top executives have come internally. Outliers have been slow to downsize. They have been slow to get rid of staff. They valued their staff, and that is a critical piece. I have people who worked for me for over 20 years, and they've done so because they understand that their values and the values of what we're doing very much mesh, and that they are valued as employees. And for me, value statement is not just about the professional employees, the people who do maybe the face-to-face work with the people we serve, but of everybody. Of saying to people who are at our front desk, you have an important part in our mission, vision, and values, because you set the table for anybody who walks in our door. You set the tone of what kind of relationship we're going to have with that person. In the same way with my maintenance staff, I say what you do is of value. If our buildings are clean, if our buildings are well kept, it is a value statement either for the people who work there or for the people who come for services in our facilities. All of those things are very important in terms of what we do, making sure that all of our employees have a sense of what our mission is, what our values are, and how they fit into that. And it's not just a matter of a simple way of looking at that, but of bringing people together to say, all of us together are interdependent. And that's an important piece of the values as well. Oftentimes, we exalt CEOs as the ones who have been successful, as the ones who've made things happen. But in reality, I can say as a CEO, I am dependent on the 130 staff members that I have to do the real work of barrier-free living. I'm there as a support person. I'm there as a guide. I'm there as a cheerleader. I'm there in a variety of ways. If something hits the fan, I'm there to back up my staff. But they are the critical players in terms of the work that we do. And that value is an important piece for everybody to understand in terms of what we're doing. A lot of the people on our management team have been brought up from line staff. When we see someone who has the potential for moving up, we're working with them. We're giving them education inside the organization, outside of the organization. We're investing in them so that they can move up because they understand the values, the culture, all of those pieces of the organization, and they come with unique sets of knowledge that are important for us to hold on to in terms of keeping the work going. And essentially, One of the things that comes up in one of the next slides, sorry, I don't have control over these slides myself. Click one more. Oh, no, that's it. Sorry. Is strong values maintain ethical standards. That people, if there are transparent values, feel confident in trying new things, feel confident in operating when they know what those values are and they operate within those values, that they will be supported. And the result of having those things in place, the value statements, the ethical standards, the support of employees, which is in itself a values and ethical statement, is a critical piece in terms of being a high-performing organization. That's my story, and I'm sticking with it. I'm open for questions.
So Paul, we have a question that came in, and here's the question. How do you manage a business effectively and have really strong ethics when you're working in a society and a culture that has a lot of problems with corruption? So what are your ideas of how to do that?
That's a good question. To me, it gets to the issue of, I think of a training I went to many years ago on managerial power. And essentially, it was looking at power in a different way, because oftentimes when we think about power, we think about control. And the whole point of the exercise that we went through with our trainer was power was about achieving the goals that I wanted to meet. And really looked from it, the trainer was the brother of the governor of Massachusetts at that point, of looking at the political process as a model to say, I don't have enemies and friends. I have allies and I have barriers. And what I need to do is to be able to reach out to people I need and find a way in which I can appeal to their interests. In other words, I'll give an example. We needed to create a housing subsidy for people with disabilities who would otherwise end up in nursing homes. I knew I had to sell that to a group of Republican lawmakers in Albany who were concerned about the bottom line more than anything else. So I went with a different kind of message. I wasn't talking about the poor people with disabilities. I was essentially saying, look, 45% of the costs are borne by the state of New York. In New York City, it costs $143,000 a year to keep somebody in a nursing home, and you're paying 45% of that. But the cost of community services, lookalike services, is $55,000. You give me a $14,000 a year housing subsidy paid for by state funds, and you will see a net gain of over $20,000. And they paid attention. I hit their self-interest. And the result was we got what we needed. It was not being in a power struggle. It was analyzing the situation to say, how do I appeal to the powers that be? Now, if the powers that be are totally corrupt, that's a difficult situation, but then saying, who within your society are allies? Who can be your champions? There are times when that's very important. At one point in time, we had a mayor in the city of New York, I won't mention names, whose goal was to sell off every piece of property that the city of New York owned, so that he could cut taxes, so that he could, profit in that sense from the city's perspective, and get rid of all that property, and promote his friends who were developers. We got a hold of one of the last pieces of property in Manhattan to develop a program, and we ended up having to go to community allies because I didn't have the power to stand up against the mayor and prevail, but our local state senator, who was also a Republican, did. And I went to her office and said, I need a godmother. I need somebody who's going to support this case. I need someone. We have lots of community support, and that was important to her as well. But I need someone who can step up and help us through this. And she stepped up to the mayor who had all the power in that situation. And we ended up getting the property, and we ended up developing the first totally accessible shelter for people with disabilities, a domestic violence shelter for people with disabilities in the country. But it was through looking at that process and saying, where can I find allies within the system that have the influence to be able to make something happen, and how can I appeal to them so that I get what I need? Is that helpful?
Yes, Paul, that was great. Thank you very much. I have one other question that's come in, and the question is, how do you, if you are the manager or the boss of an organization, how can you be ethical towards an employee that you need to fire or let go?
That really involves then a progressive action process. I think that is very critical, where we have a process in place where we first of all start with conversations. And the first set of conversations generally doesn't get recorded, doesn't get put in a person's personnel file. And if we're able to move that person along, then fine, taken care of. If with the first verbal sets of informal conversations that's not the case, what we do is bring in a witness to the process, and that's very important because we get sued a lot. And it's important that we have that in place. And usually it might be another supervisor or someone else to say, this person is here just to be a witness, and everything we say in this room is confidential. And I think it's very important for the dignity of any worker that whatever happens in that situation is confidential. And we have a verbal conversation, again, a verbal warning, and that is memorialized in a memo which does go into a person's file as a verbal warning, and we give that to the person involved and say, we're asking you to sign this. Not that you agree with everything that's been said in there, but that this is an accurate representation of what you heard. And if that solves the problem, great. And if it doesn't solve the problem, then what we're looking at is a written warning and probation, and saying you have X a period of time. And it really depends on what that person's importance is in your community. I fired a director of social services for a brand new program. We gave her a month to turn things around because she was a critical person in that process and she wasn't doing her job. And we set out a set of very concrete goals to say, you need to present me with documentation that you have supervised your staff 3 times in the month of December, it was last December, that every one of your staff members had supervision and the number of minutes that you spent with that staff member. And I expect you to have seen everybody at least 3 times. Any other month would be 4 times. It's a holiday. We're going to give you some slack. Make it happen. And a number of other things were there as part of that process. And a month later, after the holidays, we gathered with that person, the director of the program and myself, and we said, okay, let's see your work. And she did not see the 8 people that she supervised 24 times. She saw them maybe 10. And essentially what I said is, we had very clear goals. You didn't meet those goals. I'm sorry, but this is over. And along the way, one of the messages was, we're rooting for you. We want you to succeed, but this is what you need to do to succeed. And to be very specific about what those measures of success may be that has to do with the person's particular job description and has to do with the mission of your organization, whatever that mission may be. And we did not get sued by that person. And there was a very good chance she could have sued us on the basis of age, on the basis of race, on the basis of gender. But we created a fair process that gave her opportunities for success. And when she couldn't succeed, it was clear to her and to us that we had taken her through a process that it was as fair and ethical as it could be, so that we would be protected as an organization. And I said as much. We consult with lawyers when we go through that whole process to make sure that we have our ducks in a row. And that's done for the legal side of things, but the ethical side is saying, I want somebody to succeed. Here's what you need to do. And if a person can't do it, then I have taken care of my part of that responsibility. Other questions?
Yes, Paul, thank you. That was a great answer. We have one final question for you.
Okay.
And the question is, when you're creating a new organization, or if you're coming into an organization that exists as the leader or as the boss, how do you create a culture of ethics in the first place?
Good question. What we ended up doing at Barrier Free Living, it wasn't that we were unethical or the like beforehand, but when we opened up our domestic violence shelter, I said, this is an opportunity for us to step back and look at where we are and where we're going. And that's when we began to work with the work of an author named Peter Brinkerhoff. He has done a fair amount of work in mission-based management that has to do with not-for-profits. It's designed for not-for-profits, but quite frankly, I think it can be used in for-profit situations as well. And it was then that I worked on getting all of our staff together. And the first time around, I was part of all of the focus groups to say, let's look at our mission statement, which was made by our board of directors, like the 10 Commandments coming down the mountain, and had been there for years. Does this really accurately say what we do as an organization? And then looking at a vision statement to say, what do we want the world to look like as a result of what we do? And then looking at values to say, what are the things that are important to us in terms of what we hold on to as knowledge, attitudes, behaviors that are critical to us as an organization. And every single staff member had a say in that. And we would have a group and we'd bring it back to my management team and we'd look at what came from that group. We'd maybe tweak the things that had been created and then go to another group and do the same thing. And we did that through all of the groups and then took it to groups of people we serve who added their own perspective to it. And only then did we take it to the program committee of our board to say, here is, and I had prepared my board by saying, we're moving into mission-based management, which is a different way of looking at the world. Here is the result of the wisdom of our staff and the people we serve. And besides maybe changing a comma here or a period there or one or two words, my board affirmed what my staff had done. And as a result of that, when people came in, and I think of a particular researcher that came from New York University, and she said, I go into organizations and oftentimes I meet with the management team or the top people and they talk about their mission, vision, values. And then when I go in to meet the people who are doing the work on the ground, they sort of go, what? But not at Barrier Free Living, because all of those people were part of the process. They had skin in the game. And having that, and that to me is the difference between looking at power as a control issue and looking at power as I want to get to a goal issue and I want to bring everybody along in the process.
Okay, Paul, that was excellent. Thank you so much. It was really, really helpful, and thank you for answering those questions from our participants. Really, really profound and important answers around ethics and how we create an ethical culture within our organization that's influencing the entire space and community around this to be ethical and working towards an ethical world. So
and if you want to see the sort of the bones of this, our website is bflnyc.org, like Barrier Free Living New York City, BFLNYC. And in the upper right-hand corner of every page is a place that you can click that takes you to our mission, vision, and values. That's one of the ways that we have organizationally created that culture, of transparency. And it's not to say that that's the be-all and end-all of values, but those are the values that fit us and the kind of work we do. And depending on what you do and what environment you're in, you need to figure out your own values. But it's important that they're transparent, and it's important that your workers own them, and that it's known to the people who work with you, your consumers, your competitors, whoever it may be.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. We really appreciate you being
Certainly welcome.
here today.
Good luck with your day.
Thank you.